What's up, everybody? It's Justin here, and today's lecture is going to be on pot odds expressed as percent equity. And I actually had a previous version of this, and I had a couple critics give me some critical reviews on this, aka friends. Why have critics when you have friends? I appreciate them. They gave me some feedback. So I did some minor tweaks. I upgraded to this mic, so you should no longer hear a hum in the background, which is quite annoying. I should be coming in crystal clear. In fact, I'm about to play some background music, and this should not record. So back to the lecture at hand. I just want to clarify things here. Pot odds expressed as percent equity. Typically, when you hear about pot odds, they're giving you the number of the pot to your call, but simply pot odds by itself. What's important here is pot odds expressed as percent equity, and you'll see that it is a slightly different calculation. And the reason why this is important is because pot odds alone doesn't give you the equity. And equity is simply the percent chance of you hitting your draw on the turn of the river or by the river. The reason why this is important, and this is one of the first things I learned, yes, there's math involved, but not a whole lot of math, just a couple of quick ratios that you can memorize, and then you can derive the equity in between them. Just a quick few shortcuts, and I'll have a small table for that at the end of this video. So let's get started. Pot odds expressed as percent equity, and I'll start off with a definition. It's the ratio between the total pot, which includes your call amount, to your call. So I'm going to use clean numbers here just for the purposes of illustration. So when you're at the table and you see $117 to your $15 call, then you have to adjust the math on your own. But the example is the pot is $100 on the flop. Another player bets 50 and the action is to you. The pot odds, when you want to calculate percent equity, is $100 that was already in the pot, the player that let out for 50 plus your call to your call. That is the ratio. So reduced form, it becomes 200 to $50. Simplified as a ratio, it becomes 4-to-1, or to get your percent equity, you simply take your call and divide by the total pot. Simple as that. So as you can see here, you get 1 divided by 4, which is 0.25 times 100, which will get you your percent equity of 25%. As I mentioned earlier, a common mistake when you hear table talk and everything, they'll say that, oh, I got 3-to-1 on a call. That means I have, what's the incorrect way of saying this? 33%. And they don't include their call. And in actuality, it's 4-to-1, like this example, which is 25%. The reason why this is super important is because when it comes to odds and outs, there's a big difference between 25% and 33%. Probably a difference of 4 cards, 3 or 4 cards coming out of a deck of 52. It's pretty significant. So as I have outlined here in red, the common mistake is that the players forget to add their call to the pot in order to calculate their percent equity. What they'll get is the straight pot odds and not percent equity required to continue in hand if you're behind. They interpret the pot odds percent equity to be 150 to 50, which is 3-to-1, and they'll get 33%, which is exactly the same situation that I outlined up here correctly, but they're going to get a different percentage. They're going to think that they need 33% instead of 25%. Probably make some conservative folds in the process. The higher your equity, the more you can call off because you have that many more cards in the deck to help your hand if you're on a straight draw or flush draw and so on. So why is this important? And I've kind of alluded to it. We're going to go, I actually have 3 different reasons here: basic, intermediate, and advanced. I'm just going to briefly read over the advanced because I think once you get the basics down and you see how it relates to an intermediate strategy, then you can derive multiple advanced strategies. And I just had one advanced strategy in mind after you incorporate the basics. When I say basics, it should be as basic as, you know, when you go to the grocery store, most of us, we have a budget in mind. We know exactly what we're going to buy. We know exactly what we're going to get into. We know the risk or the cost to reward. If I saw a gallon of milk that costs $10 a gallon, that's too much, risk or cost for that gallon of milk, so it would not be worth it. So at the most basic level, pot odds expresses equity, allows you to calculate the price on a draw versus your equity, right? So, and here's my loose definition. I kind of did this off the cuff because I know in everyday language, equity in terms of home market, in terms of investments are, in a way, it's kind of like an investment, right? But the strict definition of that is loosely thrown around in everyday language. Equity is the value of your home minus your debt, right? So, but equity in poker, just think of it as the percent chance of hitting your draw. Um, some common high equity draws are flush draws. You get typically 35 to 36%. That's all you need for equity. Your straight draws, which is 31, 32. And I'm not giving you a specific percentage because it does vary. And this is where the advanced strategy comes in when you can include blockers or exclude blockers. Like if they hold one of your cards for an out, then you have to deduct that to get your true equity that you are required to continue in the hand. But going back to the most basic level, once you know your basic draw percentages, you simply compare it to your pot odds expressed as percent equity. If the value of your equity is more than your pot odds, then you can justify calling. But there are specific situations where, yes, say that your your abundance of outs only gives you the lower end straight. That could also be detrimental because it might not actually give you implied odds of chances of winning the hand. It'll give you reverse implied odds where you hit your hand and you think you're good, but they actually already have the better hand, even if you hit your draw. Another topic, but again, going back to the basics here, pot odds expressed as equity is simply a comparison of the cost that you need to continue dependent on the amount of outs or equity that you have, right? So in everyday terms, how much do you need to pay, and is it worth it to call a gut shot, open-ended straight draw, or double belly buster as it's called, flush draw, etc.? I want to say these are your basic, most commonly used situations where you might want to consider your equity. And it changes depending on the situation and what you base your opponent's range on. If they happen to have top pair and you have an open-ended straight draw, but you also have a pair as well, you have even additional outs, right? So again, just to reiterate, the most basic level of pot odds expressed as equity, it gives you a price on the draw versus your chances of hitting that draw. And again, you need enough equity. Your chances of hitting your draw has to be greater than the pot odds that are given to you. So moving on. So more of an intermediate strategy. Once you have these certain things memorized, and I say this because it will take work. If you've been playing poker for 5-10 years and you don't typically do pot odd calculations, or outs by saying, oh, I have 8 outs or 10 outs, that doesn't directly tell you your equity. You still have to convert those 8 outs to equity, right? So 8 outs on the flop to the river is 32%. Right? But going from your turn to the river with 8 outs is 16%. At some point, you still got to know your chances of hitting your draw depending on which street you're on. So with that being said, on an intermediate level, knowing your pot odds and your equity required, you can also deduce a range of hands that your opponent may have based on their bet sizing. So, for example, let's see if I say it here. I haven't read this document since the first video recording. Allows you to estimate your opponent's ranges. I think I said that. If they only bet 1/3 pot in position, are they on a draw going for value or both in the situation? And are they only doing this in position? So either on a conscious level or better for us on a subconscious level, if they're always betting 1/3 pot in position, what are they doing out of position with the same type of hands that they have? For example, if they're in position and they hold something like king queen and they do a continuation bet on the flop because they're in position of 1/3, are they also betting 1/3 out of position versus the same number of players? So just one of those things, because when you find these patterns and you can put them on a range, it also allows you to determine your equity. Are they only doing this with ace king suited? Are they doing this with ace king offsuit and perhaps they have a blocker to your straight draw or your flush draw? That affects that little number, that 36%, down to maybe even 32%, or as high, moves it back up to, greater than 40%, which allows you to call off a bigger bet. So if your equity is greater than 50% and they're only betting 1/3 to half pot every time, you can call all day and still be profitable in the long run. So I feel like I went a little more in depth on that than my initial video. So just let's take a moment and pause and think about that, because how often do you notice that they change their bet sizing? Now, they change their bet sizing depending on their range and their position. Position is always important because some people will raise in position with ace king, but they won't raise out of position with ace king. It's weird. You're supposed to be balanced. You should be doing it both ways, unless there's sufficient reason by gameplay or otherwise that they're doing this. Maybe someone after you or right before you is affecting the action and they're trying to make a play by mixing it up. But sticking to the basics, if all things being equal and everyone doesn't really know each other, and then you have 5-6 hours to get to know these strangers, you'll see patterns emerge. So one asterisk on that: don't establish a pattern on a player you've never seen within 2 rounds. I think that's very dangerous, because within 2 rounds, they maybe they're on a hot streak and they just feel aggressive and they're betting a certain way. That no way dictates the long run if you played with them tomorrow or the next week or the following month. You have to kind of look at how are they normally playing, and is this the way they normally play? But that's for another video, for mixing up your strategy, when to stay conservative and when to stay aggressive. So moving on, and I think I have some examples in here. I am going to attempt to keep this under 20 minutes. However, historically, I've not been able to do that. So let's move on. Okay. So this is exactly what I was alluding to here. I didn't check the document before I started re-recording this. You're looking for tendencies that you can potentially leverage exploitively. I probably saying that wrong, but you know what I mean, or GTO strategies on future hands. So again, that's going back to noticing patterns in your players, if their patterns are based on mood, if it's based on strategy, or they're just not randomly, but they're just going with playing their hand. So everything that I explained before reading that sentence, excuse me, is applying to that sentence right there. The one advantage of knowing pot odds versus your equity is not only your pot odds versus your equity, but how are they playing the pot odds on the range of hands that they have in that situation. So, as I said, I'm going to just simply read the advanced part. It's subject to interpretation, and there's going to be a lot of examples in future videos when I try to implement this. This is a lot harder to do, I think, in my opinion, just because poker is poker, right? It's played exactly the way it's played. The rules and stuff are exactly the same if you play 50-cent dollar versus $5, $10, 2-5. The gameplay is the same, just higher amounts. But the difference typically is when you play in deeper stacks, you incorporate more stack to pot ratio ranges. How are they playing their hand? How are they trying to get the most value if the pot's around 200 but you're stacked $20,000? Is a big difference between how you play that hand when the pot is $200, but the game itself, the average stack of the table is only $500. It changes dramatically. And I think with higher depth stack, there's more flexibility in that. And that's where advanced strategies come in. And clear examples of this is if you ever watch live streams on YouTube, some of the famous ones here in LA is, live at the Hustler and live at the Bike, so on and so forth. You'll see that they don't play straightforward in a lot of spots, and they don't directly do pot odds or pot odd percentage and do ranges that way. They're playing on more on the long term, and they do, I know for a fact, they do use more stack to pot ratio type of guesses on if they have a big enough stack, how often can they get paid off with the most value, and also if they have enough applied pressure because of the stack to pot ratio to get most players to fold. I mean, I don't know about you, but um, playing for a $1,000 pot is much different than playing for a $50,000 pot. Not that I would know because I have never played that much, but I can imagine the type of pressure and types of things you'll be thinking about. Like, you know, will my girlfriend ever come back to me? Or can I pay my mortgage for the next year if I lose this hand in a span of 3 minutes? Yeah, a lot of things to worry about there at those stakes. So, anyways, lucky for you. Not only am I entertaining, but I giving you some shortcuts so you can just get straight to the point. You count the total pot, including your bet, and I give you your equity percentage, right? So here, just some basic ones, and again, if you're savvy enough, you only really need to know these three. You can derive everything else from this, right? So 2 to 1, that includes your bet. You need a required equity of 50%, which is pretty high. That's probably a pair and a flush draw, and the pair happens to be top pair, and you have the nut flush draw. Those are, you know, um, those are just, close your eyes and you just do it, because you're never folding in those situations. So here are your shortcuts. Memorize it. You'll find online, if you Google pot odds, they'll give you lots of charts, but they're all derived from the basic concept of pot odds and pot odds expressed as equity. So again, here, I'm going to skip this part because I've honed this in so many times that if you strictly go off of pot odds, you're going to get the wrong percent equity if you don't include your bet in the total pot to get your percent equity. So stay away from that. Just memorize this list here, and you're good to go. And as I said, there's tons of charts out there, and they're going to tell you, okay, well, if it's 60% pot bet and you're faced with 2 calls, what do you do? It really doesn't matter. Just do the math real quick and you can come up with it. It takes a little practice and a little mentally draining at first, and perhaps a little stressful depending on the situation and how much money is at stake. But once you get used to it, I can stare at a pot, look at how much I got to call, and I'll know within 5 seconds how much equity I have. Because the reason why I think this is important for you to memorize is you want to spend a lot of time knowing pot odds, and your equity should be fairly instant, right? Because you want to spend the rest of your time focusing on the hand, focusing on the situation. Maybe they got not a lot of people agree with this, but I still think that old school poker tells is one of those situations where you're 50-50 on a call, or should I even bother with a draw, type of things. But if you get the poker tells in, whatever it may be, scratching their head, picking their nose or looking the other way, whatever it is that you pick up, that'll give you an incentive to either call or fold. So again, the math part, if you like math, this is easy. If you don't like math, just memorize this so you can understand the fundamentals of poker and math and poker, right? So you can focus on everything else. Um, so and I have an example here, just another clear-cut textbook example of what I'm saying. There's charts for this. If there's 60% equity, so a player bets 60% into a pot of $100, what are your percent equity that is required? And they have charts, so you could probably Google it on your phone while you're at the table, but I wouldn't recommend that. That just wastes time. Just do the math real quick. It's real easy. So 60% of a 60% pot bet into a $100 pot, you get 60 plus 100 plus 60, which is $220 for a pot odds of 2020 to 60, or estimate 60 divided by 220 to get around 27%. I even put this little tilde here, meaning estimate, So um, you don't have to dive into the weeds and go 26.7 versus, 26.9. That won't really matter. So sorry, math guys, but it's the truth. You won't feel the difference of that, even if you played a million hands. I don't think so, anyways. So another great critique or addition for this from one of my buds is to include a typical situation where players tend to call it off because you get the I'm going to air quote this, there's too much money in the pot. I'm going to air quote this. I have too many outs. How can I fold? And lo and behold, I came up with a very typical situation, and I'll do the math right before your eyes. Well, I'll try to. I just got off of work, so I'm a little, brain fog here. So, getting back to the math, then we can see, let's calculate how many. First of all, let's do what's the required pot odds percentage, right? So, let's begin here. So, we have 12, let's round. Good advocate for rounding. So, 1250 in the main pot, which includes the $655 all in plus your call. So, 805 plus 1250 gives us 2055. Let's call it 2050. So 800 divided by 2050 gives you an approximate pot odds expressive required equity of 39%. So let's keep that in mind, right? So how many outs do we actually have, and what is that expressed as your chances of hitting your hand? So we have a flush draw and a gut shot straight draw. 9 outs to the flush, and any 8. So that's actually 3 outs. You would think it's 4, but the 8 is also a heart, assuming that they don't have an 8. But let's go with the conservative view of 3 more outs to additional outs to the 8, because the 8 of hearts is already included in this. So 9, 9 plus 3 is 12. With 1 card to come, you simply multiply by 2. It's a rule of thumb out there, right? So 9 plus 3 is 12, so you get 24% equity. That's all you have. So since your percent equity of hitting your hand, 24%, is less than the required 39%, it's a clear fold here. So again, I'm not saying this situation happens all the time, and there's situations where you can call it off. Say he goes all in for 655 and you have $20 left. I'm not going to do the math here, but it changes. Your percent equity in outs doesn't change, but your pot odds does. Hell, let me do it anyway. So 1250 plus, if I can type correctly here, 1250 plus $20. So 20 divided by 1270 gives you need equity at 1.5%. In that case, you can call it off because your 24% is greater than 1.5%. So hopefully at this point you see the importance of it. Don't get awed by how big the pot is. Still do the math. I'd say if I was looking at this pot, and I already know I can look at it and say that it's 3/4 of the total pot that I'd have to throw in there the rest of my stack. But if it was borderline around $200-300, I'm still doing the math in my head just to make sure it's pretty close, right? So I left these cards showing because I also wanted to say that another thing you wanted to consider too is if they block one of your outs. Maybe this guy has 10-8. he has 10-9, he has one heart. So let's use that example. And this guy may have stuck around on the flop to see the turn because he has the ace of hearts. It's pretty typical. Even a king of hearts will stay in there every once in a while. But if you can at least block one heart, that decreases the equity that you have in your hand, right? So instead of 24%, it's going to be 11 outs instead of 12 outs. So you have only 22% equity, which makes the call even worse. So the ladder is slightly more advanced. I'd say after you get the hang of pot odds and the equity that you have, your chances of hitting your hand. Once you get that dialed down, really practice on subtracting and adding outs depending on the situation. It's so hard to fold situations where you have open-ended straight draw plus a flush draw and the pot is 1,000 but you have 600 behind. What do you do on the turn if they raise you all in? Just do the math. I don't know what it is exactly, but it would be pretty close in that situation on the turn. But on the flop, it's much different, right? So let's go back to this example. What did I say? The pot odds percentage expresses equity required is 39%. But as you see here, we still have the same, say the action was on the flop. He goes all in on the flop for 655. Let's use these numbers. So you still have 12 outs, but you have 2 cards to come. So 12 outs times 4, 12 outs times 4 is 48%, and you're only required 39%. So on the flop, if you wanted to gamble without a made hand, you can call there. Let me double check this. All right. So we have 9 outs. Remove 1 out of the hearts. You have 3, so that's 12. You have 2 cards to come. The 4-2 rule says on the flop, you multiply your outs by 4 to get your percentage by the river, your chances of hitting your hand. So that should be correct. 12 outs times 4 is 48% versus the 39% equity that is required based on his bet size. So it is okay to call the flop because you have 2 cards that are unseen because we don't know that the 7 of spades is coming out. That's why your percentage is so much harder. But once that turn hits, it dramatically slashes the probability of hitting your hand by half. So I didn't think I was going to dive into that, but yes, that's a very important factor. There's a big difference between calling off the same bet on the turn versus the flop. And all you veterans, I've been playing for 10 years. I hope you already know that. If not, this is only going to accelerate your game. Let's see if I have any more notes. No, I don't. And hopefully this video will come out a lot better than the last one. And I hope you took a lot of value from that. And as always, thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe and like. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments. And at some point, I will have some contact information for anyone that wants to contact me, especially if you're here in the Southern California area. I wouldn't mind brainstorming if you have ideas for the channel. Hopefully you get a feel of what type of channel this could be. So I will see you guys later. Have a good day.